Well, thank you very much, John. That means a lot. Uh, I will say one little word there about why I love doing lectures on C.S. Lewis or lectures on, in this case, I get to do lectures on Bonhoeffer. I like biography. We were talking, several of us were talking out at dinner about that. One of our favorite authors is David McCullough, because he is such a respectful biographer. And he lets the people he writes about really speak. He doesn't mock them or take advantage of them. He lets them speak, and it makes biography so exciting. And I like to think of this way. I want to be a biblical expositor, but I want to be also an expositor biographically of people, so that the person you're doing that's what I'm doing now, and I've done that with Lewis a lot, to tell the story of Lewis's life and his journey. But I want always to let Lewis speak, so that in a way, it's not, Earl Palmer said this about Bonhoeffer, Earl Palmer said this about Lewis, but that you get to see that Lewis is speaking for himself too. And I think, I just say that's a neat thing to do, if you can do it, is to try to help an author to speak for himself, so that in a sense, the same exposition that you'd use at the Bible, where you want to let St. Paul speak for himself, make his own point. And I like to think of that in exposition. In exposition, you want a book in the Bible, an author, like if you're reading St. Paul, you want Paul to speak for himself before I say what he says. Make sure you hear him. And I think the same kind of rule of thumb is good to use in biography. And I would say that with regard to you when you're trying to share this with your children. You know, children love to hear you share things, providing you don't take advantage of an author or take advantage of something and let the author make his own point. And then, in a sense, they'll really welcome that and like it when they see that an author or a writer is making his own point, and you're just trying to help them get into it. So I always say to parents, I want you to read the Chronicles of Narnia to your children, and I love to read aloud. I like to, in fact, tomorrow today I'm finishing the journey of his life, and tomorrow I'm going to really try to work with Bonhoeffer's actually stuff he wrote, and look at his letters, and we'll try to let those letters speak for themselves, and they're quite remarkable. And we'll do that with this tremendous literature that we thank God we have. But like I've said to parents, when you're reading, like you want your kids to read the Chronicles of Narnia, okay, read it aloud, but don't make comments. Let the story flow over their head. Let it flow. Don't code it right away and say, you see where he might be referring to Christ there or something like that. Don't do that. Let them see it. And let the story just flow over a person's life. Same thing with Lord of the Rings. Let it just come. And then finally, maybe at one point you might say about Lord of the Rings, why is it that Tolkien doesn't let anybody carry the ring? Why is he insisting on a halfling carrying the ring? Well, of course, in the story, Gandalf the wizard says so himself. He said, even I would not carry the ring because I know it would tempt me. And I'm trying to get the halfling to carry it, some ordinary person to carry it. And let the story make the point. And with your kids, it's wonderful to introduce them to a book, and say a book you like, but do it in a way where you do it expositionally. Let the story do the selling. And then, because isn't it funny? People don't want to read something that you're trying to advocate for them. They think you've got an angle. I wonder why my dad wants me to read this book. What political persuasion is he trying to sell on me? But if you can somehow share, hey, I read this book and it meant a lot to me, and I'd love to know what you think about it. Read it, and then maybe read aloud stuff together. Husbands and wives especially can do that. Read aloud. My wife can read while we're driving and she doesn't get car sick. So we were able to, that's a great gift. And so with our kids growing up, we read so many stories in our car because while we were driving, Shirley could read aloud, and the kids would always say, "One more chapter, please, Mom, one more chapter," because she would be reading it aloud, and they would come up with all the insights. And you don't have to say, do you see what this means? Do you see what this means? Don't do that. Let a story flow over you, okay? Lewis has a great line, get yourself out of the way when you're reading a story. Get yourself out of the way and let the story flow. Okay. Well, now what we're doing today in this hour, to continuation of this morning, we want to kind of finish the story of the journey of this man. And so we'll start with the end of where we ended up. Okay, the end of, I had my notes all neatly organized, and then, all right. In 1924, he has this great experience in his own faith, and he shares it. We read that wonderful quote where he tells about how he made that discovery. And I didn't want you to miss the fact that he discovers a kind of joyous faith. And he got that from that biblical discovery of faith, and it's true. People like Luther and Karl Barth and others shared, and certainly his friends, Becky and these other friends, shared with him in that. He does very well academically. He goes to these various schools. He does get his. He writes a dissertation. He gets honored for it. Act and Being, and then he wrote some of his Barthian theology in Act and Being, where the word and work have to go together. And he did it, but he didn't really get to do much academic teaching. He got, you might say, an assistantship at the University of Berlin, but not. He didn't get very far into it because he decided he wanted to have some pastoral experience, and so it was a good thing he did. He went to Barcelona and served the German church in Barcelona, and that was 1928-29. So he goes down to Barcelona, and he has a lot of fun there, a lot of enjoyment, and teaches and preaches in a German congregation. Like, I have a special fondness for this part of Bonhoeffer's life because I spent 6 years of my life in a Union church, an American church abroad in Manila. It was the Union Church of Manila, which had been founded kind of as a expatriate congregation in Manila. And so I have a very warm spot in my heart for Bonhoeffer's part of his journey. So he was in Barcelona, and he did that in 1928-29. And then he gets a scholarship and goes to New York City and studies at Union Seminary, New York. That's where he meets some very famous American people. Reinhold Niebuhr he meets. Paul Lehmann he meets, and in fact Paul Lehmann becomes his best friend. And by the way, I have a kind of a special interest there because Paul Lehmann was my professor at Princeton Seminary too. Now I didn't agree with Paul Lehmann because, in fact, I wrote a paper in Paul Lehmann's. He was a contextual ethicist, and he was the father of contextual ethics, and he went on to Harvard after Princeton. But he was my professor, and I thought the world of that man, and he held to a view of ethics that I felt was not what I liked, because it wasn't what I would call formation ethics. And I had been already under the influence of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, which had been a great influence of Paul Lehmann. And they were the best friends during that New York period. It was Paul Lehmann and Dietrich Bonhoeffer. In fact, we have a whole collection of and I have it in my briefcase, of the Paul Lehmann Bonhoeffer letters. It's kind of funny, they're very recently discovered. Paul Lehmann released them, letters that Bonhoeffer wrote to Paul Lehmann. And one of the funniest parts of the letters is there are several of the letters where Bonhoeffer urges Paul to pay him back for the money that he loaned to Paul. When he was in New York, because Paul Lehmann didn't have as much money maybe as Bonhoeffer did. Remember, Bonhoeffer came from an aristocratic family, and he had loaned money to Paul Lehmann so he could buy books. And so 3 of the letters, and so I respect Paul Lehmann for releasing those letters, because 3 of those letters is Bonhoeffer saying, I would really appreciate it if you would repay me that money that I loaned you. You don't see that very often in letters that are being preserved. And so I respect Paul Lehman for doing that. But when I was a student at Princeton, I wrote a paper, and I got an A in that class from Paul Lehman, in which I took him on against contextual ethics, and I used the Bonhoeffer ethics book as my way of taking on Paul Lehman, because Bonhoeffer had what he called formation ethics. That, again, the very thing that Barth did in Barmen Declaration. Let the text speak, and then get your ethics from the text, rather than starting with the questions that you get to raise for which there are answers, which is contextual ethics. I get to raise the questions, and then I'll let God answer them. But what about letting the text start the questions, and then build your ethics in that way? And so I did, and I did get an A in that paper. So here it proves. I always say to people, some people say, I don't know if I want to go to that seminary. There are going to be professors there I don't agree with. Will that help me or hurt me? Well, I put it this way. If you get a good grade from somebody who doesn't agree with you, is that grade worth more than a grade from somebody who you're saying everything you know that guy agrees with and you like? So if you can get a good grade from somebody who does disagree with you but yet says, hey, you did good work, I ask you, what is worth more? And so I treasured that A. But it is funny that when Paul Lehman left Princeton to go to Harvard, we had a farewell dinner for him. And I did a lot of stand-up comedy when I was a seminary student, and I was asked to give the student tribute to Paul Lehman when he left. I'm sure he didn't remember this. He's gone to be with the Lord now, so he can remember it if he wants to. But I got to give the farewell to Paul Lehman, and what I did was I stood up and just imitated him, the way he lectured. And I did that, and it made a big hit, because but I did pay tribute to him too. But at any rate, he was a great man. And so Bonhoeffer met him, and he met also other heroes of American Protestantism when he was in New York. And if you read the Matakis book, Eric Matakis takes a great deal of delight in showing those two trips to New York. That one of those was 1929, 1930. And then he went to London and was pastor of St. Paul Aldgate East, a German congregation in London. Now this was a little more complicated, because in this church, where he was the pastor of the German congregation in London, there were a number of them that were staunch German Christians, and they were really pro-Nazi, and then there were a number that were not, and so he risked his leadership in the church to have his congregation. Remember I told you that the Nazi Party put up Bishop Mueller to become the head of the German Christian church in Germany, and they had a vote of all the people to vote for Mueller. And of course, the Nazi Party was so much in control that they got everybody to vote for Mueller, and he won overwhelmingly, except for this London church. They voted no against Mueller as bishop of the German church. And so Bonhoeffer risked a lot of his leadership with that church in urging his church to say, no, we don't vote in favor of Mueller, because Bonhoeffer by then was not in favor with those policies. So anyway, he goes to the German church, is there. He gets some modest recognition by going to ecumenical conferences in London and other places. But it's interesting, he gets a couple of letters from Karl Barth, his mentor, his teacher, saying, come back to Germany. We need you in Germany. We don't want you in England or Spain or America anymore. So he does. He comes back to Germany and becomes a part of the confessing church in Germany itself. Then coming back to Germany, everything is billowing up. I already gave you several allusions to this right now. As you know, Hitler becomes the chancellor. But I didn't give you some of the facts about how it worked. In July 1932, there were elections in Germany, and the National Socialist Party only won 37% of that. You know, they have the parliamentary system of government, so that it's the party that then chooses chancellor or chooses prime minister, like in England, same thing. But they only won 37% of the vote. And then in January of 1933, Adolf Hitler, that's why when Bonhoeffer wrote his After 10 Years piece, it was in January of 1943 that he wrote After 10 Years. It means after 10 years of Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. But in 1933, in January, he becomes the Chancellor of a coalition government. And a coalition government means you have to take the parties that can create a majority in Parliament. Same thing works in the British system or other parliamentary systems. And so he becomes Chancellor of a coalition government. And then February 27th, which is a date that everybody remembers in Germany, a fire broke out in the Reichstag. And almost everybody, historically looking at it, believes it was started by SA workers in Hitler's own National Socialist Party. But who knows? But everybody felt some communists must have done it. And they found a young Dutchman who was a communist, and he was accused and prosecuted for that crime. And he was a mentally disturbed young man. And maybe, who knows, he was guilty of arson, who knows. But at any rate, that's always been a very dubious historical moment. The Reichstag was burned, and you want to know an interesting irony? That young Dutch communist was sent to the University of Berlin to be psychologically analyzed. And guess who was the professor that supervised that psychological analysis of the young Dutch communist? Karl Bonhoeffer, the most famous psychiatrist in Germany. Isn't that interesting? The head of psychiatry at the University of Berlin. So that's just one of those ironies of history. But at any rate, after the fire of the Reichstag, von Hindenburg, who was the president and greatly loved, for instance, by this man, not I, Joachim Fest's father, they were pro von Hindenburg. They respected him, the president of Germany. And Hindenburg was a very old man at that point, but he signed a decree. And this is a very sad moment. It was the decree of the Reich president for the safety of the nation and state. And that decree by von Hindenburg gave absolute authority to the chancellor. And that was the legal basis on which Adolf Hitler had absolute authority from that point on, because of the Reichstag fire. And they said, oh boy, we got to be worried about the communists. They were mainly worried about the communists. The communists are on us now. And so that von Hindenburg signed that decree, and that was the legal basis. So we can't say that Hitler did a takeover of power like a coup. It wasn't a coup. It was, now it may be that his party and members in his group put pressure on von Hindenburg, and there's a lot of evidence for that, and actually wrote the decree, but the decree gave absolute authority. Temporary, it was temporary authority, but it was absolute authority so that they could root out other arsonists that might be trying to destroy Germany. So that was the decree. And that was the legal basis then for Germany. And then I already shared with you that Hitler then began to try to build a case for how they had these great dangers that they had to ward against. One, the Jewish bankers, and then the need for Germany to have a strong army. By the way, everybody supported that. We've got to have a strong army because we've got the Poles on the north are persecuting our people. The French got a whole bunch of German soil. We've got to be careful of them. And then great parts of what would be modern Czechoslovakia where Germans were now, again, Habsburgs were getting soil from us from the Versailles Treaty, and so we've got to be careful of all these enemies that now surround us. So there was this feeling that Germany was surrounded by enemies, and we need to have a strong army. And then, of course, the Aryan fascination with the Aryan race, that we should make the point that national Germanic, Nordic superiority needs to be affirmed. And that's where Nietzsche comes into the picture with that sort of Nietzsche theory of will to power and strength. So the state church, which then is the next target for Hitler. And so then we get the Aryan paragraph. And then we get the recognition of the governance by the election of Bishop Mueller, who is elected. All this happens in 1933, 1934. And the pastors are really alarmed about this, and several pastors, and those pastors formed a group called, typical of pastors to come up with a title like this, the Pastors Emergency League. It sounds like pastors would come up with a title like that. But the Pastors Emergency League, Karl Barth was a part of that because he was then teaching at the University of Bonn until he was literally kicked out because he refused to do the Hitler salute. You had to do the Hitler salute, Heil Hitler, every day in class before you could teach. And Barth said, I start my class with prayer instead, and so I can't do that. And so he lost his position at Bonn, which turned out fortuitously for the world, because then he moved on to Basel, where he carried his whole career out from Basel, which we are grateful for. But at any rate, the Aryan paragraph is inserted into the church. Bishop Ludwig Mueller is made the bishop, and he's elected in a nationwide vote, with the exception of that church in London that Barth was able to make sure they didn't vote, but still he won that election. And then the Pastors Emergency League calls together in May of 1934. They called together pastors and laity from across Germany. Barth was not there. Bonhoeffer was not there because he was in London at that time. But they write a declaration, and I'm asking him to print it up so tomorrow, when we're looking at the teachings, we'll see that great declaration. It has 6 articles, and the amazing thing about the articles is they're all biblical, and Germany is never really mentioned in the articles at all, and Nazism is not mentioned, the Aryan paragraph is not mentioned, and yet all of the great themes that they come from the biblical text to show that in Jesus Christ is neither east nor west, and in Jesus Christ we're not a tribal faith. You think about it today, tribalism is one of the greatest dangers to the world today. The fact that my tribe has a right to persecute other tribes, and their other tribes are terribly dangerous to me. And that tribalism was not just a German phenomenon in 1934. It is sort of one of the curses that I think the world, modern world, is facing right now, which the Barmen Declaration, we'll see it when you get it. You're going to get it in your hands tomorrow. It's a great anecdote for the danger of tribalism. One of the anecdotes would be the Barmen Declaration, and it's 1934. Then the tightening of governance. The funny thing is, the church has never been good in trying to fight with governance issues, because the government has got all the advantages since they're paying the salaries. They're paying the salaries of the pastors, so obviously, how do you fight your case on the governance basis? And that's where Barth and Niemöller said, no, we've got to fight it on the basis of our faith. It's faith, what we believe in, and what is positive. That's how you build your case. Like, that little essay I read to you about optimism. Notice how that is it's positive, it's not negative. We're going to say, don't take away our powers, or don't take away our authority, or don't take away our money. We'll share our faith and make that the basis of the case. And that's what happened. And I'm grateful for that witness that those folks did make. But the governance is definitely stacked against them. In fact, Bishop Mueller even rewrote the Beatitudes and gave a new list of Beatitudes for believers. And I didn't read them all. I'm just going to read one Beatitude because it's one of my favorites. The third Beatitude, I gave a whole sermon on this a couple weeks ago. So I love the third Beatitude. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Okay, wow. That's a great Beatitude. But you know the word meek, I'll give it a little word study now. The word meek, paus, in Greek, is used in the first century exclusively, and our Lord would have known this because Jesus knew Greek. It is used exclusively in the first century to refer to animals that can be trained, like a horse. A meek horse, or a prowess horse, is a horse that can be trained. That's why you should never say meek and mild. Never put those two words together. You wouldn't say that about a horse. A horse is meek and mild. No, a horse is meek and well trained. And the strong horse is well trained. And so the word meek means teachable. Teachable. And our Lord is saying, blessed are the teachable. And anyone who heard him knew that that's what that word means. So, and I love that. Blessed are the teachable. They'll inherit the earth. And how are you going to solve global warming? By being teachable and learning scientifically what you've got to do. Don't posture, don't make up a lot of slogans. Learn. Learn how to solve that problem. And the same thing with racism issues, the same thing with a whole lot of issues. You have to be teachable in order to solve these issues. And that's our Lord's third beatitude. Bishop Mueller changed it. Blessed is the one who is a good comrade at all times. He will get on well in the world. And that, of course, will help soldiers to be good comrades, but not necessarily teachable in the sense of but they're teachable with their, like Bonhoeffer's mother said, with their back broken maybe. But no, not just a good comrade who does that, but who's teachable. And so he did that. He changed it. And then they required of all the state pastors in the state church, and of course the Catholic priests were not included in this. Remember, I told you, the one thing that the Catholic Church had going for it was it did have its ordinance, its order. So maybe you should be grateful you have John as a bishop, because in my denomination we don't have bishops. We have the presbytery plays the role of the bishop, good and bad sometimes, But and I'm not advocating against my Presbyterian church. That's why we need a confession of faith to protect ourselves from bad bishops, But at any rate, and you have a great confession of faith too in the Anglican Church. In the Episcopal Church. But at any rate, the Catholic Church had a whole different ball game, as I said, in coping with Hitler, in coping with National Socialism, and that is another whole story. That's why I do highly recommend the book Not I, because it gives you the Catholic side of people who did withstand and held to the faith. But the state church, the Lutheran Church of Germany, which was called the Evangelical Church, or then they were now renaming it the German Christian Movement. The German Christian Movement, they redid the relationship of pastors to the church. And listen to this. Bishop Mueller required all state church pastors to take this pledge. I swear that I will be faithful and obedient to the Führer of the German nation and people, and obedient to the Führer of the German nation and people. And then he's named Adolf Hitler. That's why the SS took a personal oath to Adolf Hitler. To Adolf Hitler, comma, and observe the laws and conscientiously fulfill the duties of my office, so help me God. What an insult to give God the credit for helping him to do that. And every pastor had to take that in order to get paid by the German church. And so, can you see what the pastors were up against? And it would be a very, very difficult thing. And so these pastors that signed the confessing church movement, some of them did sign that finally in order to, they compromised that way, feeling I have to, I mean, after all, St. Paul says we should be obedient to Caesar, give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and give to the Lord what's the Lord's. So, okay, so be careful that you don't say everybody who signed that then was a terrible, terrible person. As a matter of fact, Bonhoeffer, with his group of young pastors who didn't sign that and therefore became non-registered pastors, they were informal pastors then. Bonhoeffer does encourage many of those pastors to join the army like he does. And that'll be another story. I'll tell you about that in a minute. He joins the army. And because he said, if I am not with my people in their hour of trial, I'll have no right to be with my people in their hour of rebuilding. And so he felt that these young confessing church pastors could do more good if they could be a chaplain in the German army and help those members of the German army they got to work with. The SS did not have chaplains, but the army did. And as you know, some parts of the German army were more humane than other parts of the German army. General Rommel was the general that many of the confessing church group tried to recruit to be a part of a general's takeover against Hitler. He was an honorable man. But you know, so many of those confessing church pastors were urged to join the army because the war is coming, and then become a chaplain if you can, and help keep the guys as humane as possible. And so, and probably other people would say, oh, what are you doing? But you got to be careful. So Bonhoeffer is now working in this little Finkenwald school until the Gestapo closes it. And so he has a chance to have 6 classes of young pastors. And they're there for 6 months. And now they're not getting paid, so they have to be supported one way or another and be there for 6 months to be trained in this little big house that they had. And Bonhoeffer, that's a joyous period in Bonhoeffer's life. And he's teaching, and also it's a highly productive period in his life. He's writing. He writes his great book, The Cost of Discipleship, 1937. Notice the dates. He writes Life Together, 1937. He's in a very productive period of his life, writing, and he does, remember I read to you how he got a chance to give a couple of sermons during that time. He got to give a sermon at the Olympics, 1936, to the Confessing Church group, an informal meeting, and a large crowd came to it. And then he got, but then it all began to, then he was finally, in 1938, he was told that he could not preach anywhere. But, because they got scared of that. But at any rate, he had this class and this school. And now I'll give you 2 funny stories. I taught a Bonhoeffer class in Seattle a few years ago, and a member in my class was Alfred Bauer. Alfred Bauer was a member of my church, and God bless him, he's gone to be with the Lord now. And he was in my church in Seattle, and Alfred Bauer was from Germany and became a famous pediatrician in the United States because he invented, if any of you are pediatric surgeons and all, you know that he created a certain kind of device called the Bauer device that they put on children to give them blood and stuff while in the midst of surgery and stuff. And he became quite a famous pediatrician in the Northwest. And I taught my class on Bonhoeffer, and I was doing it just like with you are. And I was going through, and I said he had the Finkenwald School, and a lot of amazing things happened then where parents who were believing parents wanted their children to be confirmed. But they didn't want their children to be confirmed because that's a very big thing in the Lutheran tradition, and as it is in the Anglican tradition. And your Episcopal tradition is the confirmation of a young believer. Age 12 or 13, in my Presbyterian church, it's a big thing too. But the Lutherans, it was very big. Your confirmation is a very big moment. And parents that were believers did not want a German Christian pastor to reading a beatitude like the Mueller Beatitude, did not want that pastor to confirm their youngster. So they would go over to Finkenwald or find a confessing church pastor informally, and they would informally ask him to train them for confirmation. And then they would be confirmed. And I told that, and Alfred Bauer came up to me afterward, and he said, thank you for telling me that. It puts together a piece of the puzzle in my memory. When I was a boy, I was in Hitler Youth, of course, like all the boys were, and my mother and father did not want me to be confirmed in the church in our city. And they made me go over to a village and be confirmed by another pastor, and I never knew why. And it just endeared him to his parents, and he was endeared then to this Bonhoeffer crowd, that I was confirmed by a confessing church pastor, and I never knew why. But my mom said, I just don't want that pastor to confirm you. I want this pastor to confirm you. And then Alfred Bauer went into the Army, and now here's an interesting story. He was captured by the Americans in the Battle of the Bulge, and when he was in the prison camp, out in the prison field, the relocation camp that the Americans had set for German soldiers, he met his brother. He thought his brother had been killed, and they met each other out in the field during that incarceration by the Americans. And then he came to America, became a pediatrician, and became a member of my church, and wrote up the whole history of the Bauer family, gave me a copy of it. Great man. But I'll give you another story. There was a very wealthy family in Germany named the von Wiedemeyers, and they were extremely wealthy. And they had a daughter and a son. And the son was in the Army, ended up in the Army, became a major in the Army finally. But they had a daughter, and they did not want that daughter to be confirmed by a German pastor, but a confessing pastor. And they brought that daughter, Maria von Wiedemeyer. I don't know if you can see some pieces of the puzzle coming together. 16-year-old girl, and the young 32-year-old, 34-year-old Dietrich Bonhoeffer, single, and had decided I'll never get married because I'm not supposed to be married. I'm supposed to just be giving myself to this cause. He was asked by that family to prepare their daughter for confirmation. And guess what happened? He fell in love with that girl. And that is the story of the fiancé. She became his fiancé. And unfortunately, her parents wanted them to wait 1 year before they got married, and otherwise there may have been a marriage, but no. So anyway, he honored her parents. But isn't that something? And so that is the story of this Finkenwald school. And so you can see it was a very happy period in Bonhoeffer's life, and he fell in love during this period. And it is just part of the puzzle of the whole story. Okay, and so he writes, and tomorrow we're going to especially look at his writings, because tomorrow I want you to see this man speak for himself in those writings, and we will do a little bit of it today too. Then in 1939, remember the family's got a lot of money. So in 1939, his family decides that maybe he ought to make another trip back to New York. Now, I don't know whether the family was hoping that maybe he would stay in New York and not come back, because they could see handwriting on the wall, maybe that this guy is in danger because he's getting in too deep. But at any rate, in 1939, he goes to New York, and really, some of Eric Matakis' best stuff in his book is correspondence from Bonhoeffer when he was in New York in that second time. His brother, Carl Friedrich, remember? That's the non-believing older brother who became the physicist. And so they always carried on a dialogue and arguments about faith and all. But Carl Friedrich was in New York too, because he was being interviewed by the University of Chicago to become a professor of physics at University of Chicago. So he was quite a well-known physicist anyway. And Bonhoeffer is there with his brother, and there is some really funny stuff here about the time in New York. I'll let you read a little bit about it. I'll read a little bit about it, where he writes. Well, to make a long story short, they go to the Radio City Music Hall, and they see the Radio City Music Hall, and Bonhoeffer does not like it. I was going to try to find that part where he didn't like the Radio City Music Hall, because I love the Radio City Music Hall, but he thought it was. He just did not think it was not edifying at all. He's a little bit. Darn it! I had that. But also, he goes to church in New York, and he doesn't like the church. So I'm going to read one analysis of Bonhoeffer listening to a sermon. You ask if you want to hear this, have this man analyze. Now, this is painful for us as pastors to hear. On July 2nd, 1939, I went to Park Avenue Church. He's a radio preacher. Today is ours. And then now here's Bonhoeffer's comment on the sermon. No text. See? He's been too much under Bart's influence. You got to have a text. No text, no echo of the Christian proclamation. Rather a disappointment. And then he says, he's a little bit too hard on us here. Americans speak so much about freedom in their sermons. Freedom as a possession is a doubtful thing for a church. Freedom must be won under the compulsion of a necessary freedom. For the church comes from the necessity of the Word of God. Otherwise, it becomes arbitrariness and ends in a great many new ties. Whether the church in America is really free, I doubt. Anyway, that's a little bit hard on the American church. But anyway, he's there in 1939, and he's with his brother Carl Friedrich. And I wish I could find. I had it, and I didn't. I didn't mark it like I should have marked it, so I could read it to you. I'll do it tomorrow, about Radio City Music Hall. I will read that. But anyway, he's there, and he decides quickly he gets homesick. He gets homesick, maybe for Maria, but he gets homesick for Germany. And so he decides to go back to Germany. And all of his friends in New York are urging him to stay because he has a big scholarship. He's being offered all kinds of, because he's by now, Cost of Discipleship and Life Together has been published in English. And so he is now known by American theologians, and they want him to come. And so he, Reinhold Niebuhr, Paul Tillich, and other people in the United States are urging him to stay. Instead, he writes a letter to Reinhold Niebuhr and also to Paul Lehmann and says, if I am not with my people in their hour of trial, and he senses an hour of trial is coming to Germany and the world, then I cannot have a right to be with my people in their hour of rebuilding. And he takes the last ship that leaves New York for Germany before World War II. And he goes back to Germany, and that's 1939. He comes back. And by the way, before he comes back to Germany, he does go to England on the way, because remember, England is that English church. It was a church that he had been a pastor in, and so he goes to the English church, and then comes back, and he gets a letter from Bart there when he's in the English church in 1997. In page 197. And gets urged to come back to come back. Darn it! I've got to get that right quote where he has the strong letter from Bart to come back to Germany. He says, anyway, we need you here, and I didn't mark it right, so I'll have to find it tomorrow. But he urges him to come back and says, I don't want to be too too authoritarian with you, but I feel you make a great mistake if you don't come back to Germany now. And the reason I want to find that letter for tomorrow is because Bart later felt guilty and wondered if I gave him a death sentence by urging him to come back, not knowing what would happen. But I just felt he shouldn't stay in England. He should be here. We needed him in Germany. The German church needed him because Bart sensed the great leadership. He's read Cost of Discipleship. He's read this stuff, and he knows the great leadership this man is capable of. And so he urges him to come back, and so he does come back. And now here is the controversial part of Bonhoeffer's life with all his American friends. He comes back, and he joins, through the influence of his brother-in-law, Hans von Doyehe, he joins the German High Command for Intelligence in the German Army under Admiral Canaris, Wilhelm Canaris. Admiral Canaris was heading up the High Command of the German Army, the Oberst of the German Army, Intelligence Division. And von Doyehe, Bonhoeffer's brother-in-law, was a diplomat in that service. And so Bonhoeffer comes back to Germany. Can you imagine what his pacifist friends in New York City, that he has just said, I'm going back, and yeah, look, he's gone back and has joined the army. Even Bart was offended because when he made trips, because in the German Intelligence Division, he started traveling on behalf of the German army, doing intelligence, to all of the non-involved countries in World War II. He goes to Switzerland frequently. And in one occasion, Bart hears he's in Switzerland and thinks, oh my goodness, he's a part of the German war machine. And Bonhoeffer writes him a secret letter saying, please trust me. Something like that. And then Bonhoeffer gets a letter from Bart saying, I trust you. But obviously everybody was baffled. And he goes to Sweden, and there he meets the British Bishop Bell, who is an Anglican bishop that he knew in England, who had connections with Winston Churchill. And he goes with Bishop Bell, representing Canaris, and urges Bishop Bell to tell Churchill that they should soften the unconditional surrender clause, which both Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill and Stalin had agreed to. It should be unconditional surrender, and said if you could soften that, we could probably rally. Admiral Canaris felt he had a core of German generals, and if you read a lot of books, they know that core of generals, including Rommel. Rommel, in fact, that's probably why Rommel was assassinated by the Nazis himself. Was given a pill to take. If you don't take the pill, we'll persecute your children. And so he took a cyanide pill right after the invasion in Germany, invasion in France. But they had generals that they thought were lined up that would be willing to do a peaceful coup and simply set aside Adolf Hitler. And they could not get Winston Churchill or FDR or anyone in the Allies, they could not get them to soften the unconditional surrender stand. And so Bonhoeffer was making trips. He made trips to Switzerland mainly, to Rome, because Rome was an ally of the Germans. And then in the Rome, he made contacts with the Vatican, secretly again. But you see, being in the intelligence division, it wouldn't arouse suspicion as much, but it did arouse suspicion in the Gestapo, which was under the control of Heinrich Himmler, who was the head of the SS, was also in charge of the Gestapo. And so he was very suspicious of Admiral Canaris and very suspicious of this intelligence division of the German army. And so they were watching him like hawks, and they probably didn't even know it. Maybe they did. They were being watched closely. But all of these attempts failed. For example, we have a letter, and it's in Matakis' book. The Bishop Bell pled with Churchill that to soften the unconditional surrender stance, that because there were German generals that would like to create a coup, but they couldn't do it. If all they could offer was unconditional surrender, it would look like just a treason against their own country. And so there's this interesting letter by Anthony Eden, who is the Secretary of Foreign Affairs under Churchill. And it's kind of a sad letter in a way. He says, "For the present, I do not think that it is advisable for me to go any further in a public statement." They were just hoping for a public statement from Churchill that we would welcome, or something, that would welcome the revolt of responsible people in Germany who cared about peace. "I realize the dangers and difficulties to which the opposition in Germany is exposed." This is Anthony Eden writing to Bishop Bell. "I realize the dangers, but they have so far given little evidence of their existence." See, it was secret. So they've given little of their existence, and until they show that they are willing to follow the example of the oppressed peoples of Europe in running risks and taking active steps to oppose and overthrow the Nazi rule of terror, I do not see how we can usefully expand the statements which have already been made by members of the government about Germany. I think these statements have been made it quite clear that we do not intend to deny to Germany a place in the future of Europe. So they were trying to soften this. Unconditional surrender doesn't mean we're not going to deny. And of course, as a matter of fact, the Marshall Plan rebuilt Germany after World War II, and also stabilized Japan after World War II. So America did keep its promise on that. So he says, "We do not intend to deny to Germany a place in the future of Europe, but that the longer the German people tolerate the Nazi regime, the greater becomes their responsibility for the crimes which that regime is committing in their name. Yours sincerely, Anthony Eden." And then he put a P.S. at the bottom. Diplomatic decorum prevented Eden from expressing his own true sentiment, but he jotted them in the margin of Bell's letter for posterity. "I see no reason whatsoever to encourage this pestilent priest." And that's Dietrich Bonhoeffer. He calls him a pestilent priest because they were trying so hard to get through to Churchill or get through to the Allies that maybe that approach could enable the generals to honorably overthrow Hitler. So Bonhoeffer joins the OKW. He joins the Admiral Canaris group with his brother-in-law, and he does get involved in that attempt to rally these generals. And then, of course, he gets arrested. And he gets arrested in 1943, in April 5th, suddenly. He's arrested. And the war is very much underway. And he's written the After 10 Years piece. He's now arrested in his parents' home. I've been to that home. If you go to the Marienstrasse in Germany, they have made a museum of the house where Bonhoeffer was arrested. And you can go up and see his study and the little single bed. And then they have now restored all the books that were in, because Betke and others knew the books he had, and they restored them in his shelves, the books he did have. And then he had hidden the After 10 Years essay in the attic, and the Gestapo did not find that. So that document is there as well. The sentence that Bonhoeffer heard from his father was, the men want to talk to you in your room. And because Bonhoeffer was in his sister's house, and his father and mother were over in their house, and they said, the men want to talk to you. And then he was taken immediately to Tegel. Tegel prison is a modern-day Berlin airport. The Tegel prison is where it was a prison, but then it became an airport. And now that begins his imprisonment. The imprisonment, 18 months of imprisonment in Tegel. And at the beginning of that imprisonment, it was very harsh because of he had, like every other, he was put in just a small cell and deprived of any contact with anybody. And so anyway, it was very, very harsh. But then mysteriously, and you know, that is quite a story in itself, but mysteriously, it changed after that period of about 2 weeks that were harsh. Then, and as far as we can tell, it was guards. It was guards in the prison that took a liking to this man. In fact, one of the interesting things, there's some pictures in several books of Bonhoeffer. There are pictures of Bonhoeffer in the standing out in the courtyard of the prison, because they got to go out and have exercise in the prison certain days, because it became a little less severe imprisonment. And there are pictures of guards and prisoners standing out with Bonhoeffer there with them. And the interesting thing was that those pictures, I have them over here in this big book of pictures, that there are 2 of those. And the guard is standing there with these other prisoners and Bonhoeffer. And we know from what the guard later wrote that he wanted to send a picture to his family of this pastor who was meaning so much to him, but he didn't dare just show a picture of just Bonhoeffer, because that would create suspicion in the ranks of the other guards or the commandants of, what are you doing? So he took a picture of prisoners, and Bonhoeffer is among them, and then he's there. And so that doesn't arouse suspicion. And there are several of those pictures that were sent by guards who actually were pastorally talking to Bonhoeffer and befriending him, and then many of them helping him to get his letters out, so that he wasn't just snuffed down. He was able to write. He wrote letters to Maria von Wiedemeyer, and those have now been collected. They weren't in Eberhard Becky's first book because she had not released them. They are now released, and we have those letters. And then letters to his parents, vast number of letters to his parents, and letters to Eberhard Becky mainly, and that's the letters and papers from prison. And poems, he wrote many poems. And so all of that we have as a treasure, because these guards befriended him in that Tegel prison. And then finally, after that, he is moved in 1944, after the attempt on Hitler's life. In July of 1944, everything changes, though he's in prison, but yet everybody that he had been connected with, since they were involved in the attempt on Hitler's life, they were all imprisoned, and including his members of his family and everything. And he was then moved to different prisons, Buchenwald, and then finally Flossenburg, where he was executed. So anyway, he becomes then a martyr with these others in April of 1945. But the letters from prison become a very big treasure that we get from Bonhoeffer. And I'm going to give you just a couple of examples. Oh, time is up. But I'll just read one. I'll read one poem he wrote in that period that I just think is so moving. And tomorrow we'll look at more of. He wrote several poems. Christmas poems he wrote from prison, and then he wrote letters. And we'll see his theology and everything that he believed from the letters. But he wrote this poem while he's in the Tegel prison, and I'll just read it to you. Who am I? They often tell me I would step from my cell's confinement calmly, cheerfully, firmly, like a squire from his country house. You know, it's interesting. Everybody commented that about Bonhoeffer, that many people during bombing raids and all were panicking. Guys were just weeping. But Bonhoeffer there was a calmness, and there was a joyousness that he had and he exuded. So he even admits this in this poem. Who am I? They often tell me I would talk to my warders freely and friendly and clearly, as though it were mine to command. And that is also noted, that these warders and these guards almost universally liked him. Even when he was in Flossenburg, guards in that camp also noticed the grace and the warmth that he had. You know that he was taken for execution from a worship service he offered, and was led out from the worship service. And who am I? They also tell me I would bear the days of misfortune equably, smilingly, proudly, like one accustomed to win. Am I then really all that other men tell of? Or am I only what I know of myself? Restless and longing and sick, like a bird in a cage, struggling for breath as though hands were compressing my throat, yearning for colors, for flowers, for the voices of birds, thirsting for words of kindness, for neighborliness, trembling with anger at despotisms and petty humiliation, tossing in expectation of great events, powerlessly trembling for friends at an infinite distance, weary and empty at praying, at thinking, at making, faint and ready to say farewell to it all. Who am I? This or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others, and before myself a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from a victory already achieved? Who am I? They mock me, these lonely questions of mine. Whoever I am, thou knowest, O God, I am thine. And that's one of the great poems of all time by I Am Thine. And he wrote that, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So, but notice the sense of joy and the sense of, but he's saying people say that about me. They noticed it. And so he says, I know they say that about me, but I'm feeling like a bird in a cage. He's in love with this girl and wondering if I can ever get out. But you know,
What was that little part?
it's who am I?
That I've already won, that's already been won.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'll read that line again because that is a tremendous line, isn't it? So powerful. Who am I, this or the other? Am I one person today and tomorrow another? Am I both at once? A hypocrite before others and myself before myself, a contemptibly woebegone weakling? Or is something within me still like a beaten army, fleeing in disorder from victory already achieved? Yeah. Christ has won the victory, and he knows that, and he claims it. Okay, now we'll stop for a little Q&A, and we won't keep you too long because I don't want anybody falling asleep. But or comments you want to make?
Was he shot on a firing squad? I mean, they shoot him?
He was hung.
Oh, I can't remember.
Have you, two questions about his theology, which
A little bit louder, and I'll repeat it.
two questions about his theology. I understand that Bonhoeffer actually stated at one point that he believed the Psalms to be the prayers of Christ as he walked among us. And I wondered if you had heard any
The Psalms were
were the prayers of Christ as he walked among us. And
he
the
would
other,
sing the Psalms.
I don't know, it was just something I remember from, I think.
Yeah, he says that's one thing he does to keep peace is to sing psalms. Sing songs. And he was a musician, you know. He had a very nice voice, and he also loved music and loved hymn sings. And so, so who knows? And he did do worship services that at certain points that they allowed him to do. And a British soldier who was in prison with him tells about it.
Can I just ask one further question? I think before Act and Being, he defended another dissertation on the community of saints.
Yeah, and that has a Latin title, Communio Sanctorum.
Yeah.
And that is another document that was certified. I mean, he got 2 awards for his papers he wrote as a part of his doctoral work at University of Berlin.
I was just going to ask you, do you know what he believed about the communion of saints?
Yes, that's a Life Together book. See, Life Together. And you know, the big theme in Life Together, that great book, is he draws a distinction between the church as a divine ideal. And see, that was the flaw in Nazism and the flaw in German idealism. You create an ideal state. And he says the Christian church is not a divine ideal. It's a divine reality. And that's that concreteness theology again. And that's why you can understand Bart's time. The church goes through history in understanding and in misunderstanding, in obedience and in disobedience. And yet it's not too small a thing for God to have such forms. God is willing to put up with the church. That's Karl Barth. See, that's the realism of Barth and the realism of Bonhoeffer. And but yet you've got to have that realism. Now notice how he puts it in his poem. Am I this? Am I both? You know, I'm weak, and there's strengths there too. I'm sometimes I'm teaching stuff that's wrong. Sometimes maybe. Well, then God protect me and teach me what's right. So I'm going to have maybe both, and I need to have the gospel to clarify and to strengthen me and to straighten me out. And that's what you need, a good theologian that's willing to be teachable. There you have it. Blessed are the meek.
Earl, can I put a proposition to you?
Yes.
We were meant to have a 30-minute break and then come back for Q&A.
Oh, I forgot.
But we want to preserve you in strength.
Oh, yeah.
And you got into midnight last night.
Yeah, I'm fine.
What if we just had a few more questions, and
Okay.
then we're free for the afternoon?
Okay,
to
I'm for it.
reflect.
Hey, good. Well, you know, I forgot. I wasn't looking at the schedule. I was thought it was like this morning. Yeah.
Would that be fine? Then you can take.
Yes. Because I don't want you to fall asleep either. No, I'm doing fine.
I found it interesting that Anthony Eden said of Dietrich Bonhoeffer the same thing that Henry II said of Thomas à Becket.
Oh, that pestilent priest.
Pestilent priest. Who will rid me of that pestilent priest? Now, let me suggest
Wow.
that Anthony Eden was saying something very different than what you have suggested by calling Bonhoeffer a pestilent priest.
And then a true Englishman would know, and Bishop Bell would know that's what Thomas Becket was called.
That's what, yes.
And he's the hero.
Yes.
Against Henry V.
Is it Henry II? What?
Yeah. He's the man of all seasons.
No, that was Henry the. That was different. Anyway, but I'm just suggesting that by using that term,
Wow.
Anthony Eden is saying something very, very different.
Isn't that a gift? You gave us a wonderful gift. You know, that's wonderful. I think that's wonderful.
Well, let me just put it out there.
You know, it's funny because, you know, Anthony Eden is not considered one of the great heroes of World War II as a
He's in our
diplomat.
time.
Because he was considered quite a weak Secretary of Foreign Affairs. And almost all historians are hard on Anthony Eden. But at least there, Anthony Eden is using a phrase that Bishop Bell would see is a phrase of honor.
Yeah.
He's honoring him. That pestilent priest. Yeah, good.
I Googled Karl Barth earlier this morning, and I got this wonderful piece.
Hey, good.
Pope Pius the 12th called Karl Barth the greatest Protestant theologian of the 20th century and the most important theologian since St. Thomas Aquinas.
Wow. I would agree.
We
The most important theologian, Pius XII, said that Barth was the most important theologian of the 20th century and the most important theologian since Thomas Aquinas. And from a Catholic theologian, that is big time because Aquinas is the great ox of Catholic theology.
We've touched on Karl Barth's name several times, and I just look forward to working on him a little bit.
Yeah, he's worth reading. He's worth reading. The best way to get into Karl Barth is to read Dogmatics and Outline, his commentary on the Apostles' Creed. And the thing that's great about that from our study today is that he gave those lectures on the Apostles' Creed in the University of Bonn right after World War II. The war is just over. The University of Bonn is even is debris everywhere, and he was asked to come and give lectures, and Barth gave them to these lads, the lads at Bonn, who had yet learned how to smile, he said, and he gave the Apostles' Creed, and it's brilliant. It's a little thin book, but it is absolutely brilliant. Great, and it gives you a good introduction into Karl Barth. You fall in love with him with that book.
What was the name again?
Dogmatics in Outline. It's the Apostles' Creed. Yeah, yeah, over here.
The arrest and the execution, was that for his political activities or his religious beliefs?
Well, now that's the thing. According to Matakis and others, they really believed that he was arrested in 1943. They did not know about the conspiracy, the conspiracy theory that these great under Admiral Canaris. He was then a top man, and they didn't realize that he was heading up with a general. There were several that were involved, and Bonhoeffer was obviously through his brother-in-law was involved, but they don't believe that was why he was arrested. They think he was arrested because his family was so aristocratic, and the Gestapo was very suspicious of all of this Jewish young man that was shielded by the Bonhoeffers and was able to sneak out of Germany after that Gestapo arrest. He doesn't get arrested. He gets out to Switzerland and then to England, and that was a big affront to the Gestapo, and that's why. And so Bonhoeffer was never charged. He's arrested. You can't do that, in American law. You cannot arrest a man and then not have charges. You have charges, or he has to be released. If you don't give charges, then bail or whatever, then you have to release it. Well, they didn't have that rule in Germany. They held him for questioning. Yeah.
That's habeas corpus, and it comes from English law.
Yeah. Yes. You have to have the body. Yeah.
So it was retaliation against the family.
It was retaliation against the family. And you know the irony of that arrest? 4 days before he was arrested, his father, Karl Bonhoeffer, was given the Goethe Award in Germany, the highest award for science. And guess who signed the document? Adolf Hitler. In honor of the great scientist Karl Bonhoeffer. And so the Gestapo and Himmler, who are on this war hunt against the conspiracy, they can sense a conspiracy. But then, they were looking for conspiracy everywhere anyway. And so, but they arrested him because of Hildebrand. Almost everybody thinks that was probably the reason. His successful escape to Switzerland. The Germans, during that terrible period, the Nazi period, they were so obsessed with tracking down Jews and finding them and then punishing them.
Did you, when I was taking EFM and we were studying Bonhoeffer, our leader brought us a movie that we watched about the life of Bonhoeffer. Are you familiar with it?
I've seen several, just not maybe the one you saw, but I've seen some stuff on Bonhoeffer. Some of it's very good, and some of it was not so good.
Yeah, okay. I don't know, I'd have to go back to my notes to see which one it was, but that's when I came alive about Bonhoeffer, because we were doing the reading in EFM, and it's like this, but when she brought the movie to show us the whole life and what happened before and after, up to his death, I became very fascinated with it. And
there's a great interest in Bonhoeffer in Germany right now. But you have to know that right after the war, Germany was so stunned and so grieving that they didn't want to talk about Bonhoeffer or anything about World War II. They wanted, there's a German phrase that was used, let the grass grow over it. And so there were no Bonhoeffer names used. There was no great interest in Bonhoeffer studies. It was the Americans and the British that kept the Bonhoeffer studies going. Let's face it, because they were being translated into English and everybody was reading Bonhoeffer, but not in Germany. And then in the last few years, and I saw it myself when I was in Germany, because I led a tour, a Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth tour. We went from Prague up the river, up to Potsdam, and then over to Berlin. That's when I saw all these sites, these Bonhoeffer sites. That was about 4 years ago. And Bonhoeffer, by then, I mean, it's all different now. There are Bonhoeffer avenues, there are Bonhoeffer streets, there's, everything is there. And because, but I regret this in a way. Bonhoeffer has been mainly glorified in Germany now because of, he is a hero of the resistance. It's not because of his faith. It's almost a secular celebration of his resistance. In fact, if you go to the museum, and by the way, the museum is worth going to, by all means go to the museum. It's in the former Luftwaffe headquarters. In the bombing of, when the Allies bombed Germany, they did not ever hit the Luftwaffe, the headquarters. And that headquarters is where you have the Museum of the Resistance. And if you go in, you can see a huge picture of Bonhoeffer, huge picture of Martin Niemöller, and you see a whole section on the Confessing Church. So I'm grateful for that. But you know, it's still called the Museum of the Resistance, not a museum of faith. I wish it could be a museum of the people who had faith. They didn't just resist, they had faith. And so anyway.
An apology for their belief in the Third Reich.
Yeah. They were, and they apologized for that. And Germany has apologized for that. And thank God for leadership in Germany today is a whole new leadership, and I'm grateful. I like Merkel. She's the Christian Democratic Party. Interesting, they would call themselves the Christian. They're mainly a Catholic party, Christian Democratic Party, and they're losing now a lot of votes because there's a new right movement in the right, but still, she has been, I think, a very honorable. Well,
This may be, I've been doing genealogy on my family, and my grandfather was a German Jew, and his mother was a French Catholic. And just before the 1900s, he was sent over here to America because she did not want him to be part of the German military. And when I'm trying to think about what we're talking about, even though it was World War II, there must have been something that was underlying about the young men enjoying the military, I think probably at 15. And if there wasn't an undercurrent and stirring that was going on at that time, he was never, when he was going to marry my grandmother, he was baptized and confirmed the same day, and but he had never been baptized. He didn't know if he had ever been baptized, but he had not been confirmed. And then you were talking about the children being older, and so my mind is going to that and connecting with what was going on, during Bonhoeffer's time in the military and World War II.
Yeah.
And so there must have been this underlying current going on in Germany.
now, what were those years that current would be then for your family?
It would be the late 1800s and early 1900s.
Oh, well, yeah, there was.
See, World War I.
That's World War I.
Yeah.
That's World War I.
Wouldn't that connect with what Paula, the mother of Dietrich, said about children's backs being broken twice, once in school and the second
Wow,
time in the army?
I thought
Yes.
about that.
And she, Bonhoeffer was born in 1906. Her kids were coming up when your grandfather was sent over. So
Yeah, interesting.
it's the same
interesting.
thing.
Very good.
Yeah.
Hey, aren't you grateful for great women in your life, or great mothers or grandmothers
Yes,
in life?
absolutely.
And like Albert Bauer, my friend, my Dr. friend, it was his mother that wanted to be sure that he was confirmed by a confessing church pastor, not a. It's just mothers and grandmothers are really so vital. And Bonhoeffer was very devoted to both his grandmother and his mother.
With that museum called Resistance is the Greek word that Revelation other place in the New Testament, upomane. I wonder if resistance is in effect a very good word of the kind of faith we're supposed to have in today, like today with things are so great.
Yeah. Of course, upomeno means to hang in there and to stay faithful and to stay steadfast. Oh, yeah, that's a great word. I love that word. Hey, we got to stop.
Let's stop.
Hey, you're wonderful.